things. What I would like to do is start with what's called a nigun, which is a wordless melody. And when we think about Kabbalah, there are many, many mystical practices of Kabbalah, and one of the main ones is to sing a wordless melody. And the idea is that through singing the wordless melody, your mind isn't thinking about all the words, and your mind gets to kind of let go and just sort of become one with the universe in a certain way, and one with the divine. So let's start with a wordless melody to kind of just get us in the space of being here. If you don't feel comfortable singing, that's okay. You don't have to. And it'll be pretty simple, so I think you'll be able to catch on pretty quickly.
Hey,
Good evening. Yai dai da dai da, yai dai da dai da, yai dai da dai da, yai dai da da dai da, yai dai 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 da da dai da. Part 2. Yai dai da dai dai dai, yai dai 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 dai, dai dai da da na dai, yai dai 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 dai, dai dai da dai dai dai, yai dai 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 dai, dai da da na dai, yai dai 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 dai, yai dai da da na. Yai dai da da na dai, yai dai da da dai dai, yai dai da da dai, yai dai da da na, yai dai da da na dai, yai da da dai dai, di di dai 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 da da na dai, yanna dai na 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 na, yanna dai na 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 na, yanna dai di di dai na 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 na, yanna dai na na, yai dai da da da, 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 di di dai 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 da da na dai, yanna di dai 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 da da na dai, yanna dai na 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 na, yanna dai na 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 na, yai dai 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 dai. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. Amen. From the cowardice that shrinks from new truth, from the laziness that is content with half-truth, from the arrogance that thinks it knows all truth, O God of truth, deliver us. That was the blessing that Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan used to start all of his study sessions at the Jewish Theological Seminary with. And I think it's appropriate in any context and in Kabbalah as well. So I'd like to open now. Thank you, Rabbi Eddie, for allowing me to
ran it. I'm running out. I'm not supposed to be out tonight.
Oh,
You know? Yeah. No, but I wanted to know how much I love Ben, Rabbi Ben Newman. That's why, I brought him to you. And he's a gift.
Thank you.
You're gonna have a wonderful time. And it's only the beginning. And no, you wouldn't know it if you told Dr. Max. I was under general anesthesia at the OR this morning.
Wow.
Quick recovery.
Not supposed to
strong
drive or
mind.
have a glass of wine or anything.
Really?
Yeah.
Unless you study the Zohar.
Right, in which case, although maybe if you study the Zohar, you'll be in some sort of mystical state.
So,
And they said it went well.
yeah. Nothing big, nothing big.
You need a ride.
Have a chariot outside. If you see a fiery chariot.
If we're going to continue the Nigun for a little bit longer, then...
So I'll enjoy another Wednesday night with you. Right? Nice to see
Thank you for
all.
stopping
Thanks.
by.
Nice to have Steve Rebbe.
And thank you for inviting me here.
Yeah, but this is special. His wife's a rabbi too. Did you tell him everything?
I didn't yet. No,
Oh.
we just started with the Nigun. I told
That's
Max
why I
everything because he
wasn't
came
gonna
15 minutes early, but you know.
Okay.
Bye. So I want to begin with introduction to myself, and then if we could go around and people say their names. I'm not going to remember all of your names, so
That's okay.
I-
We won't remember them either.
I will do the best I
I live in Cronin.
can. There you go. You,
I have
yes.
a joke about that.
Hey, you. So I'm Rabbi Ben Newman. I'm sure you all saw my bio. I was most recently in Fort Collins, Colorado, rabbi there with my wife Shoshana Lees, Rabbi Shoshana Lees. We were there for 7 years. I grew up in Scarsdale, New York, cousins with Beth, Bart, and Beth as well. So thank you for coming to my class. So I grew up in Scarsdale. I was not super religious growing up. I belonged to a conservative synagogue where I was a bit of a troublemaker in religious school. I didn't love being there. I was a very typical Scarsdale boy, and sort of rediscovered Judaism as a spiritual path. I was always a seeker, through high school and in my younger years, and I really wanted to know what the meaning of it all was, and I was obsessed with philosophy and Rainer Maria Rilke at 15, and I was always very spiritual, but I didn't consider Judaism as a spiritual path. For me, it was more of a cultural path, and I studied Buddhism for a while, and then in college I actually lived in Japan for a while studying Zen Buddhism. I met with Zen monks, and I was very into Zazen, Zen meditation, breathing meditation, and then in college as well, I did a junior year abroad in Israel, and I took my first class in Kabbalah. And I discovered that much of what I loved that was in Buddhism was also in Judaism, and that I hadn't been taught all of that growing up. That in a conservative synagogue, there wasn't much mysticism going on. And so I hadn't really been taught all that, but when I discovered that it was there, it was like a light bulb went off for me. And I jumped into the study of Jewish mysticism, of Kabbalah, and discovered that there were meditation techniques in Judaism that are not very well publicized, that there's the idea of a goddess, which we'll get to at some point, that the idea of God that we read in the Torah is actually not the idea of God that's in Kabbalah, that there's a much different, wider idea of God that's actually quite similar in some ways to the Buddhist idea of nothingness with a capital N. And so I started to really get into it and study, and I ended up going to rabbinical school at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. And I spent 3.5 years there, and I left there with a master's degree, and ended up finishing my rabbinic degree at the Academy for Jewish Religion, which is a seminary, multi-denominational seminary, which is now in Yonkers, but at the time it was in Manhattan, and then it moved up to Riverdale. And so, as well as serving as rabbi in Fort Collins, Colorado, I was also for a while chaplain in a cancer hospice, Calvary Hospital in the Bronx, and I was also the associate rabbi of Congregation Mavakshei Derech in Scarsdale, which is Reconstructionist synagogue, very small Reconstructionist synagogue. And so that's kind of my background, as quickly as I could get it out there. And I'm really excited to be here tonight with all of you because this is my passion, and is really what brought me back into being involved spiritually with Judaism, and it really brought me into this path that I'm on right now as a rabbi. And I really believe in the power of Kabbalistic teachings, not just for the ideas, but for actual real practices that help you in your life. I call them sometimes technologies that help us in our life, including things like meditation, but also many other sorts of ideas. So I wanted to begin by having you guys just introduce yourselves with your name, and this is going to be a little bit of a challenge for you, maybe some of you more than others, but Kabbalah talks about sort of a God that is beyond time and beyond space, called the Ein Sof, the infinite, and at the same time there are all sorts of names for God, which are what the Kabbalists might call metaphors for God, or descriptions of how God manifests itself in the world. For example, God is called Emet, or truth. God is called Chesed, or unbounded love. God is called Din, or judgment. God is sometimes called King, Melech, right? As many of us know from High Holidays, right? So what I would like to do, and I'll go first so that nobody is intimidated. I'd like people to say one metaphor for God that doesn't work for them or hasn't worked for them, and one metaphor for God that maybe has worked for them or that they appreciate and they like. Or you could just say one or the other, maybe one that hasn't worked, or you can just say one that has worked. So I'll begin. So my name is Rabbi Ben, and one metaphor for God that I've had a lot of trouble with is God as king. I'm a bit of an anarchist at heart, and I sort of rebel against that idea of God as this punitive king on high, bringing down laws. And then one metaphor that has really worked for me about God is God as female suffering presence. Right? They equate God with Rachel from the Bible, and how she mourns and she cries and she weeps for her children when something happens to them that's wrong. That idea of God has worked for me in many contexts. So who wants to go next?
Sure. Right.
Go ahead.
Okay.
First name. First name.
Oh, yeah, okay. My name is Mike Holstein. And the name or metaphor for God that derives from my youth and doesn't work is prosecutor. Mm-hmm. It was, nobody will know I'm doing this. God will know. That kind of prosecutor. And what works for me is God as journey and path.
Thank you.
I'll do
your name.
Cypress. What works for me is creativity, being able to create on the sculpture. So I always feel very, very blessed. So I don't really look at the negative.
Good. So you don't mention the negative. So good.
Erica, Cypress. The name that works for me is the one probably the American Indians use, and I like it, the Great Spirit.
Great Spirit. Yeah.
I think of God as a spirit who breathes life into all living things. I don't like the view of God where the all-merciful or the all-seeing, because a lot of bad things happen, and I don't know if God does anything about them. So
Thank you. Thank you.
My name is Carol Booth, and what works for me, I wasn't thinking about spirit, but that does work for me. I was thinking about all inclusive, or all accepting, and what doesn't work for me is the judgment.
Thank you.
Judith Levy. What doesn't work for me is the image of the white man with the long white beard.
Michelangelo painting.
Yeah. And the kind of omniscient manipulator who knows all. What works for me is God, the connector, the universal connector that's a part of all of us and that I'm a part of.
Beautiful. Thank you.
My name is Stephanie Borden. I think what works for me is God is a force, which ties into the spiritual. It's somewhat unrelated, but in Thomas Friedman's editorial today in the Times, he referenced lots of points, and we need someone that connects the points rather than isolating it. So to me, that image strikes some of what we're trying to get out now.
Thank you.
My name is Beth Green, and what doesn't work for me is the idea of God as an almighty figure who ordains what's going to happen, good or bad. And what works for me, it really resonates what a number of people said here, that, being empathetic and spiritual.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Joanne Brensilver, and I guess I'm trying to determine the answers to that. I have been involved in Buddhist studies for over 30 years, and I'm a Vipassana meditator for over 30 years. So for this moment, I would say God is breath.
Thank you.
I'm Hope Holliner. What doesn't work for me is Our Father, Our King. Both of those separately or together. What I connect most to is Shekhinah.
Right.
Which
Shekhinah is that feminine presence. It kind of what I said. Kind of what I said. Yeah.
I think of the Shekhinah as lighter than
Right. Then the suffering, the one that's suffering. Yeah. I focused on sort of that aspect of the Shekhinah. So yeah, Shekhinah has many aspects,
Yes.
as we'll learn about over these 6 sessions. So.
I'm Lawrence Holzman. I'm the principal of the religious school here, for those of you who don't know me. I always think of God mostly in terms of love. Well, you said chesed?
Chesed, yeah.
How did you define that? As unbounded?
Unbounded love, yeah.
I like that. Where God works for me is when my own children, and in nature and beauty and things like that. So I associate it with those positive images rather than judgment or...
Thank you.
I'm Jim Nordlinger. I'm really not sure, so I don't know how to answer the question. But I guess I'm most comfortable, I guess, with something, the idea of something ineffable. Or something.
Einstein said the mysterious. Yeah.
I'll take Einstein.
Smart guy.
I'm Al Gallen. What doesn't work for me actually is God the Creator. And what does work for me is a humanistic spirit.
Thank you.
My name is Mindy Shetty. I think there are lots of do work and don't work. I relate, though, as I listen to everybody, to the Our Father, Our King. I know always kind of catches in my throat, but I don't think it's so much because it is there as that it's one thing and not another, right? And that, and one of the things that comes to my mind that works very well for me is what Arthur Waska wrote a book about. God is a verb. That works very well for me.
I'm Max Kahn. What doesn't work for me is anything that suggests a kind of personhood for God. And what does work for me is the identification with ideals that humans can experience. You mentioned truth. One of my favorite little phrases in liturgy is when you say the Kiddush at Rosh Hashanah, you say, Udvarcha emet v'kayam la'ad. Your word is truth and lives forever. That we can know. We know what truth is. And things like truth and honesty and generosity, that to me.
Thank you.
Well, you gave me a terrible problem because I never think about God. I sort of feel sorry for God because nothing has worked out the way it's supposed to. And it's so sad. And it's good what Max said just now, because that's really what I believe, and not that God doesn't even include God. My religion, I believe the ethics of my religion. But I'll go home and think about, maybe you can tell me how to do that.
Well, I will definitely give you lots of other ideas about God to think about, and maybe some of them might appeal to you. But I think in many ways the Kabbalistic view of God is very close to what Max said, which is that God isn't really a person. God can be compared to people, but in terms of qualities of those people. But God is not a person in a very general sense. And the way that they describe God is a series of qualities, like truth, like chesed, like judgment. And that's in there too, in Kabbalah as well. And I think, if I could push people a little bit on that judgment idea, I think judgment is a quality that exists in the universe, right? And the way the Kabbalists describe it is, sort of the judgment that exists in the world, judgment that exists in nature, judgment that exists in people's minds and the way that we judge people, right? That is actually a quality that exists in the universe. And if that is the case, then that is part of God, because what we can see of God are those qualities. But we'll get into all of that. I just wanted to say thank you for everybody for sharing. I know sometimes it's a little hard to share something that personal that fast, but I appreciate what everybody said. And I'd like to just give you a little bit of an introduction to, I think everybody saw the email about what the class sessions are going to be, but I just want to go over the 6 sessions, exactly what everything's going to be. So today, in session 1, we're going to focus on an introduction, general introduction to Kabbalah, and an introduction to some of the history and some of the basic ideas of Kabbalah. Very general introduction. Next session, unless we decide to change it, because there might be, a swell of interest to study something else in Kabbalah, but we'll talk about that maybe later. But then the second session is supposed to focus on the Zohar, which is kind of the seminal text of Kabbalah, written in 1270. The third session will focus on Jewish meditation and other Jewish meditation and other Kabbalistic meditation and Kabbalistic and mystical practices. Session 4 is one of my favorites, which it's always good to have younger kids at this, which is Jewish magic and folklore. That was actually that was going to be my specialty in my doctorate when I studied at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I ended up not finishing the doctorate. I did all my coursework and my exams, but I was going to study Jewish magic, Jewish sort of folk magic. So if anybody needs a cure for baldness or how to make a lot of money, I can give you these folk cures, these folk spells, but I can't guarantee that they'll actually work for you. So session number 5 will be on the convergence of mysticism and ethics. Kind of jumping off what Max said, there's a whole strain of Kabbalah which focuses on these ideas, these kind of metaphors for God as ethical ideals. Like, for example, truth. Like, for example, compassion. And we'll get into that, but that's Mysticism and Ethics, session 5. And then in session 6, I want to talk about contemporary Jewish mysticism and how we see Jewish mysticism today in the Jewish world, in the Orthodox world, but also in the liberal Jewish world. And also I'll maybe talk a little bit about the Kabbalah Center and sort of my perspective on their view of Jewish mysticism. So that's an overview of the sessions. Now I want to introduce everybody to the books that we ordered for you guys. So the first book is called The Essential Kabbalah. It's by Professor Daniel Matt, who is a mentor of mine. He just finished translating the Zohar, which is, as I said, yes?
I'm going to take one for some.
Okay, that's good. Which is the seminal text, sort of the seminal text of Jewish mysticism. And there's a 12-volume work that was just completed, which is a translation of the Zohar, which is fabulous if you're wonky like me and into Jewish mysticism. But if you're not, what I got for the other text I got for you guys, which will be what we'll focus on session 2, is sort of an earlier version, very much shorter than the 12 volumes of selections from the Zohar translated by Professor Daniel Matt. And that's good night, everybody.
Good night.
So those are the first two, and then the third book that we got for everybody is called The Gift of Kabbalah. It's by Tamar Frankiel. It's sort of a modern take. It's sort of a modern take on Kabbalah, and it applies many of the ancient teachings of Kabbalah to today, and it puts them in the context of how you might use the teachings of Kabbalah to enhance your own life. And then I also got these 2 other books. I only got a few copies of them because I didn't want to get too many books. But if anybody wants to take these, you can pass them around from session to session between people. This is Ehiyeh, which is by Rabbi Dr. Arthur Green, who is a very famous Jewish theologian. And this is also, again, sort of a philosophical way to apply the teachings of Kabbalah to today. And then this is also by Arthur Green. This is a guide to the Zohar, which is the companion volume to the translation that was done by Professor Daniel Matt, and it gives a wonderful history and basics of sort of the ideas of Kabbalah and the ideas that are in the Zohar. So if anybody wants to take these for now, you can pass them around from person to person. So those are the books that we're going to be focusing on. And now I would like to start by just defining what Kabbalah means, because I've been using this word over and over and over again, and I don't think I actually even defined the word. So the word Kabbalah means literally that which is received, or the received thing. If you go to Israel and you order some food, and you get a receipt, that's called a Kabbalah in modern Hebrew. If you go to a hotel in Israel and you want to go up to the front desk, it's called Kabbalah reception. right? So the word Kabbalah in its modern context in modern Hebrew means either receipt or reception, but originally it means that which was received. And before it became associated with Jewish mysticism, it was sort of synonymous with the idea of just tradition, of what the tradition was, traditional teachings, and Kabbalah was called that which is received because it was a teaching that was given from teacher to student, and you would have to have a transmitter and a person who was being transmitted to, and that was the way that the tradition was for many generations. Even today, there are people who are call themselves Kabbalists, who have received a transmission from a teacher who received it from another teacher all the way back many generations. So that's why it's called Kabbalah in general. Now, what I'd like to do, and you'll excuse me for getting a little bit academic, but I'd like to just give people a little bit of overview of the history of Kabbalah, and how it developed over time. So, depending on who you ask, you'll get a different timeline of how Kabbalah developed. If you ask somebody from a very traditional Orthodox background, they will say that Kabbalah goes all the way back to Adam in the Garden of Eden, and that Adam received certain teachings from angels, from the angel Raziel in particular is one of them, and transmitted these teachings. And then they'll say that Abraham from the Bible was also a Kabbalist. So they'll take it all the way back that far. Now, if somebody who's maybe a little bit less orthodox, might say, oh well, it was actually more a secret teaching that existed in the temple for the priests that was transmitted from priests to priests, and then when the temple was destroyed, that tradition got transmitted to the rabbis, and the rabbis were the inheritors of that tradition. If you ask an academic, which is a large part of my background, I'm also a rabbi, so and I'm able to kind of hold all of these truths at the same time, sort of paradoxically. But if you ask an academic, they will say that Kabbalah, as Jewish mysticism, really started in earnest in the 13th century, with the emergence of the Zohar in the year 1270. Now, there's another book which is called the Sefer Yetzirah, which is sort of earlier version of Jewish mysticism, earlier version of Kabbalah, but it's unclear whether it was originally intended as a Kabbalistic text, or whether it might have been like an introduction to mathematics sort of text, or a text that was just general philosophy. There are many philosophers who quoted the Sefer Yetzirah. So let me go through this timeline just sort of specifically. I don't make any judgments here in terms of the academic perspective versus the Orthodox perspective. I just sort of list people's names of books. So I'm just going to go through this really quickly. So Abraham, they say that Abraham, according to a traditional Orthodox perspective, was one of the first Kabbalists, and he wrote, they say, the Sefer Yetzirah, which, if you look on my timeline, that's, from an academic perspective, that could have been written anywhere between 200 and 800 CE. And they say it's attributed to Abraham. And then the next sort of big figure would be Moses, right? They'd say, from a traditional perspective, Moses received mystical teachings on Mount Sinai. And then King Solomon who there's a very long tradition of King Solomon and his mystical, magical teachings. They say that King Solomon, there's a book called the Book of King Solomon, and there are many kind of apocryphal versions of it. And in this book, he talks to animals, he can summon demons, he talks to angels, and even in the Talmud, there are stories about how King Solomon enlisted the help of the demon Asmodeus, to build the temple. And he used this animal called the shamir to cut the stones, and he had Asmodeus help him find the shamir. And there's a whole series of stories about King Solomon and his demon friends who he was able to speak to. So that's King Solomon. And then we have Isaiah the prophet, and quite frankly, all of the prophets, right? They have these sort of mystical visions of God. Isaiah has a mystical vision of angels and God. I don't know if people are familiar with the Kedusha from the Amidah prayer, where you go Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzevaot, yes? Right, so that is from the book of Isaiah. And it describes the angels kind of turning to each other and God coming down into the world. So in a general sense, Isaiah was a Jewish mystic. Ezekiel the prophet is the next one that I wanted to mention, because he had a vision of God as God on a chariot in Babylon, on the river Kvar, which is sort of a prototype for the sort of mystical vision that the rabbis who came much later attempted to have. And his vision was of God on a chariot, and with these wheels underneath, and these animals that had 4 faces, and one face was a man, one face was a bull, one face was I think an eagle, and so there was a whole tradition of mystics who tried to recreate the vision of Ezekiel, and what's called the Merkava. And if people want me to write some of these words down, I'm happy to do so. Does anybody feel like if anybody wants me to write down, just raise your hand and say, can you please write that?
Write it down where?
Oh, on the board up there. So Merkava means chariot, and his vision of the chariot was called the vision of the Merkava. So it's no coincidence that on the timeline, the next thing I have is the rabbis and the Talmud, and then I have the word Merkava, because what the rabbis did was they had a sort of mysticism called Merkava mysticism. And in Merkava mysticism, they would attempt to recreate a vision, Ezekiel's vision of the chariot. Their mysticism is quite different from what Kabbalah becomes and what Kabbalah is later. The mysticism of the rabbis it's described as sort of astral journeying. I don't know if anybody's heard of like astral projection, right? That they would leave their body, their souls would leave their bodies through these mystical practices that they would do. They would chant, and they would put their head down on the ground, like in child's pose in yoga, and they would go down into the chariot. They called them the Yardei HaMerkava, the people who went down into the chariot. Very similar, by the way, if anybody's seen shamanic spirituality, right? In shamanic tunneling, they do a similar thing. They go down into these other realms, right? Into the other world, right? And so they would descend into the chariot, and then they would go from level to level, and there were 7 heavens that they would ascend. And at each level there would be a gate, and there would be gatekeepers at the gates, and you would have certain words that were passwords that you would have to say to get through the gates. And when you got all the way up to the 7th heaven, right, 7th heaven, no coincidence, that's still a phrase that's used. When you got all the way up to the 7th heaven, there would be God, and you would have this revelation of God there. And this was sort of the mysticism of the rabbis. You're looking perplexed. No, it's just... That's just the look on your face. Okay. I would say though, if anybody has a question or something that they want to clarify, just raise your hand.
It's just interesting they chose to go down to the lower world rather than the upper world, shamanically.
Right. It's interesting. But what's interesting is that they describe it as going down, but then they say that it's like going to different levels of heaven. Right. So. There's a sort of inversion of space, but what they were doing was sort of beyond space and time. And we're going to read a little text from the Talmud describing one particular mystical journey that was taken by 4 rabbis, a very famous text. And you know what? Let's do that now. Let's read that now. So let's all crack open our Daniel Matt. This book, by the way, is wonderful. It has primary sources. So this is Daniel Matt's translation of many different sources of Jewish mysticism. I'd like to invite everybody to turn to page 4. And for those of you watching on Facebook Live, I don't know, it's page 4 of the Essential Kabbalah by Daniel Matt. Can I get a volunteer to read this indented paragraph that starts 4 entered Pardes on page 4. Anybody?
4 entered Pardes. Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Aher, and Rabbi Akiva. Ben Azai glimpsed and died. Ben Zoma glimpsed and went mad. Aher cut the plants. Rabbi Akiva emerged in peace.
And so what's described here is a sort of mystical journey of these 4 rabbis. They all go up to this area called the Pardes, which is like a level of heaven, right? That they're all going up to this other realm.
Garden?
It's the same, right? It's the same as the garden, like the Garden of Eden, right? And Pardes comes from it's the same word as paradise, right? Right? Pardes, paradise. Often it's also called the orchard, translated as the orchard. But it's seen as this mystical realm that they all ascended to, right? This Pardes realm. And many people, many rabbis have said that Pardes is kind of synonymous with heaven, right? That when we die, we go to Pardes, we go to paradise. Right? So the 4 of them went in this mystical journey, these 4 rabbis, and they left their bodies and they went up to this realm called the Pardes. And there's actually more to the text that's not here now, but they're given a formula of what they're not supposed to say. It says, don't say water, water, which the reason that is because it's separating the 2 waters from each other. And in the mystical realm, everything is one. And so you're creating a separation in this upper realm. But so the 4 of them enter. And then as it says, Ben Azai died. He couldn't come back to his body. So he ended up just leaving his body. His body died, and he's just stayed in paradise. He stayed in the upper realms. Ben Zoma, they say, went crazy, went mad. And by the way, this fable is from the Talmud. And there's another little piece in the Talmud about what happened to Ben Zoma. And they say that he was found after this journey. He was found by the ocean with his 2 fingers out like this. And he says, and he just kept saying, there's only 2 fingers difference between the heaven and the earth. There's only 2 fingers difference between the heaven and the earth. And so that's how he went mad. Right? And again, it's sort of that water thing, right? He was in this upper realm, and he couldn't get back to the earth where it's a world of separation, where it's a world of differences and distinctions, right? He was caught in this world where everything is the same, where the heaven and the earth are all kind of together. And then Acher, they don't even want to say his name, but his name was Elisha ben Abuya. And there's a great book by Milton Steinberg written about him called As a Driven Leaf. I highly recommend it. It's sort of a fictionalized version of the time of the rabbis, if you're interested in sort of historical fiction. But Milton Steinberg isn't going to give the same reason for why he did what he did. But what it says is he cut the plants, and what that means is that he became an apostate, that he left Judaism, that he ended up becoming a Gnostic, somebody who believed in multiple deities. And another section from the Talmud, which goes into describing what exactly happened with Elisha ben Abuya, was that he went up to the upper world and he saw Metatron. And Metatron is an angel, but Metatron is seen as kind of the closest you can get to God, but not God. But it's this really imposing, very great figure. And he saw Metatron and he said, "Oh, there are two gods. There's God and there's Metatron." And he ended up becoming, for that reason, a Gnostic, and leaving the fold of Judaism. And they called him Acher, which means the other, which means that guy.
What does cutting the plants mean?
It means betraying Judaism. It means betraying the Jewish tradition. I'm not sure exactly where that euphemism came from. I could probably do some research.
If it's a garden.
Right, maybe uprooting. We could probably discuss, our own different interpretations of that. But Rabbi Akiva, who many of us probably know, they say he went and he came back and he was okay. And this story has been used to outline the dangers of mystical practice, and
especially if you're too young.
Especially if you're too young.
You're a woman.
Right, and Kabbalah in general, right? Even though this original story was really about Merkava mysticism, it got applied to Kabbalah as well. And maybe I'll go into that a little bit, just so people have a little bit of knowledge about that. So there are many traditional sources that say you're not supposed to study Kabbalah until you're 40, and married, and a man. And you'll have to undergo a sex change in order to study Kabbalah. But some sources, even traditional mystics like Moshe Cordovero from the 16th century, said, no, that's not actually true. You only have to be 20. And other sources say, no, you just have to have the requisite knowledge to understand Kabbalah, which means you have to have studied Torah, you have to have studied Mishnah, you have to have studied Talmud, you have to have studied rabbinic writings, and then once you have all of that background, then you could jump into Kabbalah. And in a certain sense, they're right. Unless you have a wonderful guide like me who can provide you sort of the footnotes, or like Daniel Matt in his translation of the Zohar, he gives wonderful footnotes that kind of allow you to get a glimpse of all of the references that the Kabbalistic texts are making to the Talmud and the Mishnah and the Torah, because they are voluminous. And what one of the words that they say for Kabbalah, they say they are new ancient teachings, right? And so they are based on all of these ancient texts, like the Talmud, like the Mishnah, like the Torah, but they're sort of new takes on them, and very unique sort of takes on them that are new but old in a way. But the way that they follow the tradition is very methodical. The Kabbalists are very clear about following the tradition. But so the idea here, though, is that if you either don't have the prerequisite knowledge, if you're not pure enough, if you're not old enough, if you're not ethical enough, you will open yourself up to either death or going crazy, or betraying the Jewish people and not understanding the teachings clearly enough. And that's sort of the biggest danger in terms of like having to have the prerequisite knowledge, because one of the teachings in Kabbalah talks about what's called sfirot, which are emanations from the infinite God, which are these qualities that I kind of alluded to earlier. And the danger is that, one of the dangers is that you might see these qualities and think that they are multiple gods. And often, actually, in many Kabbalistic texts, they're associated, these sfirot are associated with the planets, which are also associated with the angels, which are also, in some texts, even associated with the gods of the different nations. They say that, in the Zohar, they say that the god of that each land has an angel or a god that rules over it. So, for example, the nation of Rome, they would say there's a god that rules over Rome, and there's a god that rules over all these different nations. But the god that rules over Israel is the Ein Sof, which is the one that is beyond time and beyond space, and sort of the real God. And all of these are sort of personalities. So the danger there, though, is through studying Kabbalah, is to think that these multiple powers are actually gods. And that might make you become like Elisha ben Abuya and betray the Jewish people. And you can also sort of get how somebody might go crazy through studying some of the stuff. Maybe once we read some of these texts, you'll understand how if you don't properly understand it and you don't have a proper guide, you might kind of go nuts trying to understand it. So let me just go back to the timeline really quick. I'm trying to be sensitive to the time. We end at 9 o'clock, so we have about 35 minutes left. So Talmud times, the rabbinic times, was about 100 CE to 800 CE. And then this really important text, the Sefer Yetzirah, emerged somewhere between 200 and 800 CE. The more traditional folks, more Orthodox folks, would say that when the temple was destroyed in the year 70, the teachings of the Sefer Yetzirah were written down, but before that they were sort of an oral mystical tradition that went all the way back to Abraham. But they had to write them down because the temple was destroyed and they wanted to preserve them. And so there are more traditional folks who might say that that's when the Sefer Yetzirah really emerged. And those are the ones that kind of are closer to saying that it's around 200 CE, but they might even say it's earlier. But the most liberal academic, or most, I'd say, Orthodox-leaning academic I've seen has not put it any earlier than the year 200. And so if you want to come from a more Orthodox perspective, you would say the Sefer Yetzirah came out in the year 200. The first real references to it, though, are in the year 800. And it's possible that it was influenced by Islam and Sufism in terms of some of the teachings about numbers and about concepts of God. So Sefer Yetzirah originally could be interpreted as a philosophical text. It could be interpreted as sort of a mathematics textbook. But the way that the mystics take it is that it is sort of a guide to how the universe is constructed and how we might construct our own universes or even create living beings. So this is why, by the way, it's sort of earlier. People think it might have been written earlier because there are references in the Talmud to rabbis studying this text and creating human beings. There's a famous quote. It says, Rava bara Gavra, which means Rava, the rabbi, created a human being. And the story goes that he created a person through the use of this text and sent it to his friends. And the friends said, "You're not real," and killed it. And then there's another text that some rabbis created a calf to eat, and they slaughtered it and they ate it. But this is where the idea of the golem comes from. People have heard that legend before. And so there's one idea that the Sefer Yetzirah is an instruction manual for how to create a golem. Or to create any sort of living being. But the ideas of what's called the Sfirot, which are these emanations from God, the idea of the Ein Sof, which is the infinite beyond time and beyond space, all of this comes from the Sefer Yetzirah originally. So that's the Sefer Yetzirah. I'm just going to go quickly through some of these texts just to get them out there, but
Does that actually exist?
the Sefer Yetzirah?
Yes.
Yes, it does.
And it exists. You can read it.
It exists. You can read it. You can find a translation into English of it. There's a great translation by Aryeh Kaplan of the Sefer Yetzirah, and that was one of the first books of Jewish mysticism that got me intrigued. It's a little hard to understand if you don't have a Kabbalistic background, but you can pick it up at any Jewish bookstore. Maybe even Barnes and Noble would have it. Right. So, yes, and I'm sure Eddie has a copy of the Sefer Yetzirah. Right. So that's the Sefer Yetzirah. Sefer HaBahir is another book that came out in 1174. Also, that one is attributed to somebody earlier. It's attributed to the rabbinic sage Nehunya ben Hakana, and it's also sort of one of the first texts that is called Kabbalistic, right? That's called a text of Kabbalah because it presents some of these basic ideas like the Sfirot, like Ein Sof, the things that I mentioned before, the emanations and the infinite. And then I'm going to skip around a little bit. Nachmanides was a very famous rabbi who was born in 1194. He was mystical. He had lots of sort of mystical teachings, but it wasn't exactly Kabbalah in the sense of the Sefer Yetzirah or the Zohar. He had sort of a general mystical view. And then there are what's called the Hasidei Ashkenaz, right? So Hasidism is something that started in Eastern Europe in the 18th century, but there were earlier versions of Hasidism that existed in rabbinic times and also in the medieval times. And this Hasidei Ashkenaz were sort of a different sort of Jewish mystic. They believed in demons and monsters and dragons, and there's this book Sefer Hasidim, and it's very sort of folk magic material, and they would engage in practices like rolling in the snow and rolling in brambles. They did what's called ascetic practices, right, where they would mortify their flesh in order to have some sort of mystical union. So that's the Hasidei Ashkenaz, not Kabbalah. I wouldn't define that as Kabbalah, by the way. And then there's Isaac Avako, who was another one, and then Abraham Abulafia, who's also not quite Kabbalah, but very interesting sort of mysticism where he would combine letters and put them together to form sort of nonsense syllables and meditate in order to have a prophetic experience and receive prophecy from God. And he was a very interesting character. If you look at his history, they say he made a journey to the Vatican. That's well documented, and they say he was going to try and convert the Pope. But the Pope ended up dying like the next day or something, so he didn't end up doing it. But he was a very interesting character if you want to look up Abraham Abulafia. And he engaged in this sort of letter mysticism. And it's a very, and we'll talk about this a bit in the third session, which is on meditation and mystical practices, but he would chant certain combinations of letters, and he would have certain head movements and body movements in order to get to this point of ecstasy and prophecy. So let's continue now. I just want to go a little bit more of the history. I'm going to skip a lot here. I'm going to go next to Isaac Luria, who's the next big teacher of Jewish mysticism in 16th century in Sfat. After the expulsion from Spain, many Jews ended up in Israel, particularly in the land of in the town of Tzfat in northern Israel, and they used the Zohar and earlier Jewish mysticism and created their own sort of form of Jewish mysticism. Then a little bit later, there was Shabbatai Tzvi, who was a false messiah, who used a lot of Kabbalistic teachings and Isaac Luria's teachings to have sort of a different view of the tradition. And what he would say is that you have to break the halacha, Jewish law, in order to force God's hand to bring the redemption. And he would do all sorts of crazy, wacky things. And he had a huge number of the Jews of Europe following him. I mean, this was not a minor movement. Shabbatinism was huge until he got captured by the Muslims, and he got forced to convert to. They said you could either convert to Islam or have your head chopped off, and he decided that he would convert to Islam, and so he lost a lot of his followers. But actually, to this day, there's a group that you'll look online for called the Donmeh, D-O-N-M-E-H, who are descendants of these followers of Shabbatai Tzvi. But as a result of Shabbatai Tzvi, there was a big backlash against Kabbalistic teachings in the Jewish world.
Where does the Zohar come in?
Oh, I skipped the Zohar. That's so funny. The Zohar is 1270. And I can't believe it. I don't see it here. I guess I left it off the timeline altogether. Oops, right. So 1270 is the Zohar. And maybe I kept it off on purpose so you could all write it in, so you remember that date.
You have people here. You don't have.
There are some texts and there are some people as well. But the Zohar is attributed to Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a 2nd century rabbi, sage, and very famous, a student of Rabbi Akiva. And he has some mystical stories written about him in the Talmud, and particularly in Tractate Chagiga of the Talmud. If you ask an academic, they would say that the Zohar was written by a man named Moshe de Leon in around 1270, or Moshe de Leon maybe and a circle of Kabbalists around the year 1270. And the reason academics say this is there are several reasons, and I'll go into this in our Zohar session, which is the next session. But one reason is that his wife, after he died, said, "My husband wrote the entire Zohar from his own mind." So that's a good, proof there. And another is that much of the language he used, there were many words that he used that were actually from Spanish, medieval Spanish. And then the third sort of proof that's given is the geography that's described of the land of Israel is not accurate, as if somebody they didn't quite live there. So probably written by Moshe de Leon in the year 1270.
So maybe she knew that he wrote it from his own mind because she dictated it.
So maybe she wrote it. Yeah.
She dictated it into his mind.
Maybe she did. Maybe she did. And what I like to do is I like to say, when I talk to sort of my Orthodox friends who might say that Shimon Bar Yochai wrote it, I might say, well, maybe the spirit of Shimon Bar Yochai, came to Moshe de Leon and helped him write it, or maybe he was inspired by the spirit of Shimon Bar Yochai in a certain sense. But that's the Zohar. That's the year 1270. Thank you for pointing that out. I didn't even mention it. Kabbalah was sort of on the back burner until Hasidism came about, which is really Kabbalah was there, but it wasn't really focused on. There were several teachers, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, there was the Vilna Gaon, but the Baal Shem Tov and Hasidism really brought back Jewish mystical teachings and Kabbalah brought it to the fore, and popularized it in many ways, and sort of moved away from this idea that it was more of an exclusivist teaching, and wanted to share these teachings, these mystical teachings, with everybody in the whole world. And that's Hasidism, which exists to this day, in the form of Chabad, and many other Hasidic dynasties that still exist. As the stories go about the Baal Shem Tov, he was sort of a quirky, mystical figure who lived in the woods, and sort of the original hippie sort of thing, and he was very anti-authoritarian in many ways, and mystical and magical, and over time, I think Hasidism became sort of more institutionalized to become what it is today, and it became the purview of dynasties, right? Who were these rebbes who were students of the Baal Shem Tov. But in its first generations, Hasidism was sort of revolutionary. It was about bringing Judaism out of the institutions, where the rabbis kind of held it, and bringing it away from sort of the cerebral into a lived way of being Jewish. What the Hasidim would say, and the Baal Shem Tov would say, is that you can connect to holiness and God through whatever you do. That if you're a baker, you can bake to God. If you're a singer, you can sing to God. And that's where the idea of nigunim, wordless melodies, came from. Is the Hasidim. They began this practice of using wordless melodies to connect to the divine. You gonna?
No, I just like it.
So that's where Hasidism came from, and it sort of became something different. But even to this day, you can recognize that the Hasidic Jews are different from sort of Orthodox, like German Orthodox or Lithuanian Orthodox Jews, in that they're much more about the feelings of it. They're much more about the joy of Jewish practice. But for many today, if you see a Hasidic Jew, you can't really tell the difference between them and an Orthodox Jew. But Martin Buber, who was born in 1878, is a great philosopher and thinker. He wrote several books on Hasidism, sort of romanticizing it and returning to this idea of Hasidism as a spiritual path. And then there are several other scholars I'm just going to go through. Hillel Zeitlin was originally Hasidic, but he became sort of a modern philosopher. A very interesting character if you wanted to look him up online. Gershom Scholem is the foremost scholar of Jewish mysticism. He's sort of like D.T. Suzuki was for Zen Buddhism with the West. He brought Kabbalah to everybody's attention. Although I don't think he would have taken it seriously as his own spiritual path. He was more of an academic of Jewish mysticism, of Kabbalah. Once, when somebody introduced him at an academic conference, they said Kabbalah is shtut, which means like nonsense. But the academic study of Kabbalah, that's scholarship, and that's what Gershom Scholem does. So he came from sort of that German academic studies of Judaism. And then there was a Rabbi Yehuda Ashlag, who was a Kabbalist. He's sort of the founding person of the Kabbalah Center. He didn't found the Kabbalah Center, but the Yehuda Berg, who started the Kabbalah Center, said that he was in the tradition of Yehuda Ashlag. And then Menachem Mendel Schneerson, I need to mention, who was the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the last Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he definitely brought Kabbalah to the fore in his time. I put down the Kabbalah Center. I put down B'nai Baruch, which is another sort of offshoot of Yehuda Ashlag and his teachings. And then I put Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who is the founder of Jewish Renewal. And he was a rabbi, a teacher of mine, and a teacher of my teachers, who was sent out by the Lubavitcher Rebbe in the 1960s, along with Shlomo Carlebach, who's a very famous Jewish musician, to bring the Jewish college students back to Judaism. And they ended up sort of being influenced by the college students in the 60s, and so Reb Zalman sort of started his own Jewish movement, which was, many call it sort of a neo-Hasidic movement, which is taking sort of the mystical ideas of Kabbalah and the joy and the idea that everybody can access Judaism from Hasidism, but updating it for a modern day with modern values. And so he founded Jewish Renewal in the 1960s. And I would say, in a general sense, it's what you might call New Age Judaism, or a New Age approach to Judaism. And that is another form of Kabbalah that exists today. I think it's good enough for the background. Maybe as the classes progress, there will be more opportunity to go through some more of these thinkers. So I wanted to now crack open our essential Kabbalah texts and begin a study of some of the basic ideas of Kabbalah. The first one I want to start with is what I mentioned before, which is Ein Sof.
What page are you on?
We will begin on page 24. Can I get a volunteer to read? Anybody? Beth? The essence of divinity.
The essence of divinity is found in every single thing. Nothing but it exists. Since it causes everything to be, no thing can live by anything else. It enlivens them. Its existence exists in each existent. Do not attribute duality to God. Let God be solely God. If you suppose that Ein Sof emanates until a certain point, and that from that point on is outside of you, you have dualized. Outside of it, you have dualized. Realize, rather, that Ein Sof exists in each existent. Do not say, this is a stone and not God. Rather, all existence is God, and the stone is a thing pervaded by divinity.
All right, so back up to the beginning of this. There's sort of a lot there, but it's a very simple idea, which is that God is in everything. Right? God is basically synonymous with the universe. They say in Kabbalah that God memale kol almin v'sovev kol almin, that God fills all of the worlds or all of the universes, if you believe in a multiverse, which actually Kabbalah does talk about a multiverse. Way before physicists were talking about a multiverse, Kabbalah was talking about a multiverse, right? So God fills all of the universes, all of the worlds, and God surrounds all of the worlds. Sovev kol alamin. And then they say, Umi biladecha ein shum mitziut klal. And without you, there's no reality at all. And this is sort of the idea of Ein Sof. Ein Sof is that which kind of fills everything and is the basis behind all reality. I sort of see it as like the Force in Star Wars. You know, it's this force that is within everything and beyond everything. Now, I would like to say that Ein Sof is seen as being beyond time and beyond space and beyond any sort of definition we can make. and that you can't apply any words to it at all. And this is